All right, so you're here because you want to understand complex situations like really quickly and thoroughly, right? I mean, none of us have endless hours to just like wade through dense reports and stuff, but we
For
still need
sure.
to grasp the core of what happened, like what actually went down and why it matters, especially when we're talking about some of the darker chapters in history. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We're going deep, really deep, into a particularly tough period in Sri Lanka's history.
A period, I would say, that was really marked by, well, intense internal conflict and, a deeply concerning number of alleged human rights violations.
Exactly. We're going to zero in on the years between 1983 and 1994, and we're going to be focusing specifically on extrajudicial killings and disappearances.
Yeah.
And the roadmap for our deep dive today is this collection of sources we've gathered, some really detailed reports from Amnesty International, news articles from that time, some of our own research, and accounts from international observers who were actually there on the ground.
Yeah, and these sources, they're pretty varied, which is great because they give us this, comprehensive picture. We see the meticulous documentation of the alleged abuses alongside insightful analyses of the underlying systemic issues that may have contributed to them. It's a lot to unpack. So our goal today is to synthesize all this information for you, pulling out the crucial insights in a way that's, well, informative but also manageable.
Think of it as a shortcut to getting a solid understanding of this really complex situation. We're going to try to pinpoint the key aspects, like the nature and scale of these human rights abuses, who, according to these sources, was involved, how the government responded, or perhaps more tellingly, how they didn't respond. And then there's this persistent issue of what's often called impunity, especially during this era in Sri Lanka, which was just incredibly turbulent. And it's really important to emphasize here that we're sticking strictly to the information presented in our sources. We're not bringing in our own personal political viewpoints, okay? All right, so let's unpack this. This is a complex and difficult period, so where do we even begin to get a handle on it?
Well, I think a good starting point would be to lay out the timeline, just to understand the factors that really fueled this surge in violence. The sources we have point to a lot of existing ethnic tensions, with the 1983 Black July riots often being identified as a major turning point.
Yeah, right, Black July. Those were those horrific anti-Tamil riots, and they're widely seen as a real catalyst. Like, they ignited a significant rise in Tamil nationalism, particularly in the Northeast, where those calls for a separate state were, like, really gaining momentum.
And at the same time, we saw a strengthening of Sinhalese nationalism in the South. So you can imagine this created a really unstable and frankly very dangerous environment. And, by the mid-1980s, the sources start documenting this deeply troubling increase in disappearances, especially in the Northeast.
And Amnesty International's reports are, like, crystal clear on this. They documented over 680 disappearances in the Northeast alone by, like, the middle of 1987. That's a huge number in such a short period of time.
Yeah, it is. And tragically, the violence wasn't just limited to the Northeast. The signing of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord in mid-1987, which was actually intended to bring some resolution to the conflict, it ended up having some unforeseen and devastating consequences in the South.
Right. The Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna, the JVP, it's a Sinhalese militant party, and they had this, like, strong anti-establishment ideology. They really gained traction in the South because they were so opposed to what they saw as Indian interference. They really felt that the Accord was like a form of Indian imperialism. And this fear, it led to, like, a really brutal campaign in the South.
Yeah, the JVP started this campaign of assassinations targeting, members of the ruling party, leftist parties that supported the Accord, members of the security forces, even like their families. And they enforced these really widespread strikes through, intimidation and threats. It was a very volatile situation.
And this is where it gets really, really disturbing. The sources describe how the security forces and even groups aligned with the government, they kind of adopted these counter-terror tactics that in a lot of ways mirrored the JVP's brutality.
And this resulted in this massive escalation of extrajudicial executions and disappearances, particularly in the South during 88 and 89. Some observers at the time, as noted in the Amnesty report, estimated that potentially as many as 30,000 people were either killed or disappeared in the South during those 2 years.
30,000 people, it's almost unimaginable. And it wasn't just rough estimates. The UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, the UNWGEID, they had nearly 8,000 cases reported to them by December 1993. And the vast majority of those, according to the sources, occurred after 1983.
Right. And that number, even that, it's likely an undercount. I mean, you have to remember that those UNWGEID figures only reflect the cases that were actually reported to them.
Hmm.
It's highly probable that many more incidents just went unreported. And, the connection between the extrajudicial killings and disappearances in Sri Lanka during this time, it's crucial to understand. Essentially, many of those who were reported as having disappeared were likely victims of, well, extrajudicial executions while in custody, with their bodies being secretly disposed of by the security forces.
The Amnesty report really emphasizes that point.
But it wasn't always done in secret, was it? No, it
Question.
wasn't, especially in the South, particularly those suspected of being JVP members in 88 and 89. Their bodies were often dumped very publicly, by roadsides and fields, even in cemeteries. And tragically, these bodies were frequently mutilated or burned, sometimes on pyres made of rubber tires. It was horrific. And this pattern, including the use of these, like, plainclothes death squads, it later spread to the east when the military redeployed there in 1990. So you can see this climate of intense conflict. It really led to this just appalling surge in human rights abuses.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this escalation of violence, these disappearances happening on a massive scale. The next obvious question then is, what was the government's response? Or, maybe more accurately, what wasn't their response? Because the sources paint a rather bleak picture when it comes to accountability.
Yeah, that's a central point that's highlighted in the Amnesty International report. They state very clearly that they weren't aware of a single case of alleged extrajudicial execution or disappearance committed in the Northeast between 1983 and 1987, where a member of the security forces was actually charged with anything.
Not a single case. That in itself is just a shocking statistic. And it's not like there hadn't been concerns raised before this period. The Chavakatcherry police station case in 1979. Individuals last seen in police custody, then they subsequently disappear. This was actually investigated by a parliamentary select committee.
And that committee's report, which was released 4 years later in 1983, it actually contained quite a bit of information that pointed to the likely fate of these individuals. They even named a police officer who was allegedly involved. And the committee recommended that a special team of investigators be appointed to look into it further.
But instead, the government directed the police to investigate themselves. And, as the Amnesty report notes, no information about any progress in those police investigations has ever been made public. It just sets this really worrying precedent for how these kinds of allegations were going to be handled moving forward.
It does. And, this lack of accountability just continued. Take the case of Father Mary Bastian in January 1985. He was allegedly shot and killed by security forces. And initially, the government's information department even reported his death as happening during an offensive against terrorists.
But then government officials denied this, and they even suggested that he had, gone to India. And despite the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, recording statements from 6 witnesses, it doesn't appear that any action was taken against the security forces who were allegedly responsible.
Right, and then there's the case of the Thambaluval disappearances in May of '85. 23 young Tamil men were taken into custody by the Special Task Force, the STF. And, compelling evidence detailing their arrest and subsequent disappearance emerged during the trial of Paul Nalanayagam in mid-1986.
And again, despite this evidence being presented and recorded by the High Court, no action was taken against the STF officers who were implicated. This repeated failure to hold the security forces accountable in the Northeast, it really fostered this growing climate of impunity, which the Amnesty report explicitly points out. Impunity essentially means a lack of accountability where those responsible for these abuses aren't held to account for their actions, often with the knowledge or at least the tacit approval of the authorities. It's a really dangerous situation to be in.
It is. And it wasn't until the international community started putting some serious pressure on Sri Lanka regarding its human rights record that the government even began to initiate some investigations. The Kokadishalai Commission of Inquiry in June 1991 is a notable example of this.
Right, so this commission was established after this, intense international pressure to investigate the killing of 67 villagers by soldiers. And it was the first inquiry of its kind in Sri Lanka into alleged military abuses. But even this, according to our sources, was, far from satisfactory in terms of actually ensuring accountability.
Yeah, and what's particularly revealing are these procedural shortcomings. I mean, while the commission did have the authority to summon witnesses and take evidence under oath, these powers weren't fully utilized. You had 17 soldiers who appeared before the commission, but only the commander in charge on the day of the killings actually provided evidence, and that was unsworn testimony.
And lawyers representing the survivors and eyewitnesses, they weren't allowed to cross-examine the commander or any other soldier. And that's despite the fact that civilian witnesses had been subject to cross-examination. Amnesty International raised some serious concerns about these fundamental flaws in the process.
Yeah, and the government's justification was that the commission acted in accordance with Sri Lankan criminal procedure by not compelling a suspected offender to give evidence against themselves. Now, while that has a basis in law, it doesn't really address this crucial point that these potential suspects could still be called to give evidence about the events while, retaining the right to remain silent if they were directly implicated. The commission clearly didn't compel all of those who were believed to be involved to give evidence and have it properly scrutinized, so it fell short of international standards for investigating extrajudicial killings.
And what was the outcome of this, already compromised inquiry? A trial before a military tribunal, not a civilian court, as the commission had recommended. And in the end, none of the 20 suspects were found guilty of murder. The lieutenant in charge received a conviction, but only on lesser charges, and everyone else was acquitted. And as Amnesty International highlights, there was no further attempt to investigate who was actually responsible for the murders. So we see this pattern of limited accountability just continuing.
It does continue, yeah. This pattern of limited accountability, it's there with other investigations that were initiated after public outcry or international pressure. Committees were formed to look into killings in Polonnaruwa, and police investigations were announced for incidents in Melanthani and Velaveli.
The Melanthani case did progress to preliminary hearings, with some soldiers eventually being committed to trial. But the Velaveli investigation, which was looking into the reported killing of around 10 people by soldiers, it seems to have just stalled. And that's despite the fact that the Prime Minister at the time stated publicly that it would be thoroughly investigated.
And then there's the case of Wishadasa Lianaraki, who died in custody. The High Court recommended reopening investigations into his death in March 1991, citing some pretty incriminating evidence against a Deputy Inspector General of Police, a DIG.
They did reopen the investigation, but the retired DIG was able to leave the country. He later returned and was even appointed to a senior government position as vice chairman of the Ports Authority. And that original recommendation to investigate his role in the Lanarachi's death, it was never implemented.
Right, and what's really revealing here is the action that was taken regarding the DIG after that. Instead of like a full and impartial investigation into the really serious allegations surrounding Lanaraki's death, the authorities actually filed charges against the DIG in several newspapers, and those charges were for allegedly bringing the government into disrepute after he spoke publicly about death squad activities. And those charges, they were later dropped after he issued a statement that seemed to retract some of his earlier claims. It really highlights this potential prioritization of protecting the government's image over rigorously pursuing justice for alleged abuses.
And it wasn't just a lack of formal action. The sources also detail this, like consistent intimidation and threats against those who are trying to seek justice. The death threats against Richard de Zoysa's mother and her lawyer during the inquiry into his murder, those are like particularly chilling examples of this.
Absolutely. And later, similar threats were reported in connection with the excavation of mass graves at Suryakonda. So it really demonstrates this continuing sense of impunity, even as efforts were being made to uncover the truth about past abuses.
Which brings us to a case that really seems to encapsulate this whole issue of government inaction in this pervasive climate of impunity, the abduction and murder of the journalist Richard de Zoysa.
Yeah, the details of this case, as they're presented in the sources, they're really disturbing. So in February of 1990, de Zoysa, who was a well-known journalist, broadcaster, and actor, someone who had been critical of the government, he was abducted from his home in the early morning hours by armed men who were believed to include police personnel.
And his mother, Dr. Menarni Saravanamuthu, she was actually there. She witnessed some of the abductors. And tragically, the next day, his body was found washed up on a beach. He had gunshot wounds. It's just the sheer audacity of it, to abduct someone from their own home in a suburban area, it's shocking.
And what happened afterwards just further underscores this whole problem of impunity. At the inquest into his death, Dr. Saravanamuthu stated very clearly that she could identify 2 of the abductors. Then, 3 months later, she recognized one of them on television. It was a high-ranking police officer, Senior Superintendent of Police, Rani Gunasinghe.
And what was the government's response to this? You have this direct identification by an eyewitness. Did they immediately arrest this high-ranking officer?
They did not. The police actually declined to arrest Gunasinghe, and this crucial lead, it was essentially ignored by the authorities. Instead, both Dr. Saravanamuthu and her lawyer, Badi Rirakun, they received death threats. Even the police officers who were assigned to protect the lawyer received threats.
Almost unbelievable. The very people who were supposed to be investigating are being threatened, and this high-ranking suspect, identified by an eyewitness, remains free. And the notes we have detail how the police were reportedly very slow to file investigation reports, clearly indicating a lack of genuine will to actually pursue this case.
Yeah, Anthony Heaton Armstrong, who was an observer from the International Commission of Jurists, the ICJ, he attended the magisterial inquiry, and he noted his profound concerns regarding the police investigation's distinct lack of enthusiasm and the Attorney General's rather defensive stance. He also felt that the court was unfairly deprived of the opportunity to properly assess Dr. Saravanamuthu's identification evidence, which was, crucial.
He even went so far as to formally recommend the immediate arrest and committal proceedings for SSP Guna Singh. But as our sources show, this recommendation was never acted upon. And the ICJ observer even noted this prevailing assumption within the police force, that SSP Guna Singh couldn't possibly have been involved.
Yeah.
And that Mr. Wirakun's efforts to really pursue the truth were just dismissed out of hand. It's troubling.
It is, and the eventual discontinuation of that magisterial inquiry, it just further highlights the obstruction of justice in this case. The murder of Richard de Zoysa really became this stark and tragic symbol of the broader culture of impunity and the very real dangers that were faced by journalists and human rights activists who dared to speak out against the government. Some observers even linked his killing directly to his reporting on human rights violations or a political satire that he was believed to have written.
So looking at these various cases, we see this really disturbing pattern. Independent findings, court recommendations, they're often just disregarded, not acted upon. The Paul Nallanayagam trial revealed significant evidence in the Sangalaville disappearances case, yet no action was taken against the STF officers who were implicated. The High Court's clear recommendation to reopen the Wijadasa Lianarashi investigation stalled and was ultimately ignored.
Even the Presidential Commission on Disappearances, the PCIRP, by March 1994, they had submitted 56 case reports directly to the president. But further action on those reports seems to have been extremely limited. It really highlights a significant and really concerning disconnect between the findings of these investigative bodies and any actual accountability for the alleged perpetrators.
And it seems like any progress at all, however limited, often only happened after significant and sustained international pressure. We saw the government initiate some investigations like the one into the Kukutikshalai killings only after facing this, considerable international scrutiny and condemnation.
And while the government did accept some of the recommendations that were put forward by the UNWGEID and Amnesty International, the effective implementation of those safeguards remained highly questionable. And you see that evidenced by the fact that there were continued reports of human rights violations and this persistent climate of impunity throughout this period.
So as we start to bring this deep dive to a close, it's undeniably clear from the sources we've looked at that between 1983 and 1994, Sri Lanka was grappling with this really serious and systemic issue of human rights violations. And these extrajudicial killings and disappearances, they were occurring on a, frankly, shocking scale.
Yeah, and the persistent climate of impunity and the significant challenges in holding the alleged perpetrators accountable, despite the existence of evidence and despite, considerable international pressure, these are deeply concerning themes that run consistently through all of the material we've explored today.
And as we've discussed, the case of Richard de Zoysa really stands out as this stark and tragic illustration of these much broader issues. You have the alleged involvement of high-ranking officials, the deliberate obstruction of justice, and the very real and very dangerous threats faced by those who dared to try to seek truth and accountability.
And it's important to reiterate, as we said at the beginning of this deep dive, that in presenting this, often difficult and disturbing information, we're not endorsing any of the political viewpoints that might be contained within those original sources. Our aim here has been to accurately convey the factual information and the analyses as they are presented in these historical documents.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Given the deeply documented and very persistent challenges in achieving justice for these human rights abuses during this particular period in Sri Lanka's history, what do you think are the long-term consequences for a society that's, grappling with this kind of history, this perceived lack of accountability for these very serious violations? And what does all of this suggest about the fundamental role and the actual effectiveness of both domestic and international mechanisms in ensuring that those who are responsible for these widespread and egregious violations are ultimately held to account? It's a heavy question, but it's one that feels really important to, to sit with after this deep dive.